venues. So what we are going to do today is start really broad. So imagine an upside down triangle. We are going to start with the history of citizen science, and we'll take you back to the 19th century and just bring you to today. How did we arrive at things like budburst and Inaturalist? And then Paul will talk about phenology science. What is phenology? And then in the last part, we will actually engage in budburst, and hopefully you'll all learn a new skill by the end of our talk here. You can obviously leave at any time, come back if you have any questions. As Kathy said, you can write them in the chat box and she'll stop me, and any questions at all are welcome. So let's advance on. We're going to talk about citizen science, and the phrase I want you to keep in mind is we care about what we know. Okay, so I'm from Massachusetts, of all places, and this is Walden Pond, and I used to swim here as a kid, and of course I had nothing to do with citizen science then, and in fact I would characterize my family as people who don't like to be outside, and so this being at Walden Pond is one of my first memories of being outside, and it now I realize that that is really the roots of my academic pursuits. So I'm sure you're all familiar with David Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and in the 1800s, he lived on the banks of the Walden Pond, and he, like others, like Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold, he took observation to a new level. He really layered on this aspect of journaling, right? So we all love to do that when we're outside and sketching flowers, etc. So this is a human pursuit in America that is 200 years of roots. And that I would call Thoreau one of the first citizen scientists, but in his day, we didn't even have science. So think about that for just a moment. Natural history really predates our objective realm of the scientific process, right? So the idea of the scientific process and what is science today, proliferating in so many disciplines, really has its foundations in these early observers. These are people who lived on the landscape, and for colonial members of our society in America, this was an experiment, right? They were coming to a new land. They didn't have that cultural knowledge that had been passed down. And so these early observations really told us something very important about how North American ecology works. And in fact, I think you can still see my camera, but in fact, we as scientists today still rely on this example of a paper, still rely on Thoreau's journals and the journals of other natural history historians, just as Paul just said. Because as we talk to you today, we're going to be focusing on what is the point of all of this, right? Why citizen science? Well, the focus largely, the big umbrella on ecology for the last several decades has been climate change. And what is climate change? How do scientists study climate change? They observe nature, just like Thoreau did. They compile, abiotic measurements like about climate, and then there are also the biotic measurements about what's going on with the plants and animals. And so this is citizen science, and it has had a long, rich history, and it wasn't really even called citizen science until a couple of decades ago, but these terms, community science, participatory science, civic ecology, co-management, crowdsourcing, participatory action research, native knowledge, and traditional ecological knowledge are examples of things that you might hear, you might read about, they might be happening in your community, and they all fit under this umbrella. So who are citizen scientists? They're individuals who participate in scientific activities under the guidance of professional scientists and organizations. So this is actually our government's definition. And Paul and I have been talking a lot about how, this forging this path towards citizen-started science, right? So the idea that you have to be under the guidance of professional scientists is up for debate. That's kind of shifting, but this is the definition we currently have. And then the seminal authors for citizen science, Rick Bonney, really came from Cornell, and Cornell has a rich observation or a rich history of programs involving, ornithology and other ecological pursuits. So they define citizen science as research collaborations between scientists and volunteers. And so notice the word collaboration there. And then I will note also in the UK, the governmental definition of citizen science does include the word volunteer. And that's another part of the semantics that's up for grabs, because you don't have to volunteer to be a citizen scientist. Anyone without a terminal degree pursuing science is a citizen scientist. So that includes, all students and all people in pursuit of that degree. So when we think about this terminology, there's the word citizen scientist, which we already covered, and then there's this idea of informal science education. So this is a term used by the United States government to refer to citizen science activities and other science learning experiences. So ISE could look like taking data collection, it could look like environmental education, it could look like lots of things in many disciplines. And science literacy then is the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision-making, participation in civic and cultural affairs, and economic productivity. So the way that this all fits together in my life is I'm an ecologist and I'm a botanist, and we don't even teach those classes at the university. So I teach non-majors almost all the time, except when I'm teaching botany or resource and conservation. But more often than not, my audience are non-majors. And so this idea that I'm helping them to build a skill set that is required for personal decision making and participation in civic and cultural affairs is extremely important to me as a human being and professional in academia. And so it just kind of makes sense that I've sort of landed at citizen science. And I will just stop for a moment and say, like, back when Paul was my professor, like, citizen science didn't exist. And I just, in COVID loneliness, reached out to one of our other professors who said, hey, Paul just lives in Berthoud. And so it all started, and it's just been so fascinating to me to think about how, we all kind of coalesce at this need for more monitoring, and it all looks like citizen science, but it does a job of increasing the science literacy of the participants. And so when you look at the scholarly literature about citizen science, you see some certain foci. The science literacy gains for volunteers who participate in citizen science is a huge category of literature in this field. The government actually cares more about what people gain in terms of science literacy than they care about our research that we need as ecologists, astronomers, medical professionals, whomever engages citizen scientists. Now, for me, being first trained as a restoration ecologist, like classic biology, I personally approached citizen science as I needed to look in the data in the scholarly literature to find out about the credibility of the data collected. So if I'm going to have volunteers collecting my data and I'm going to publish it in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, I have to know that that data is just as good as any data that I could collect. And so this is another conversation going on in the scholarly literature. And then finally, of course, there's the applied component to it. If you employ citizen scientists, and employ, I just mean engage citizen scientists, we need to know that that meets a cost-benefit analysis that's positive for natural resource management. So there's a lot of arguing in the literature about whether it costs more to train people to help than it does to just put that money right into the natural resource management projects. And so it goes back and forth. And some of the interesting findings, just to quickly note, are that there's no evidence for demographics playing any role at all. And so who you are has no bearing on the credibility of the data collected by citizen scientists. So for me, I really look to the education of the individual, right? Since I'm an educator. So that's what I'm particularly interested in knowing about, is what can I do as a leader to train my citizen scientists to collect reliable data. And that's where we're at. And I will just stop here for one sec because Kathy asked me to talk about iNaturalist. So some of you attended the iNaturalist working group meeting that I held last month. I went to the statewide board and I said, hey, I want to get involved in this like virtual alternative engagement since my chapter won't be seeing each other for a while. And so we got this idea that we would meet in, a virtual platform, and we would look at iNaturalist on our computers from the backside. And if you're familiar, how it works is I make an observation, and once other people confirm my observation, it becomes quote unquote research grade. The credibility of the data increases. But there's millions of observations and very few of them are research grade. So we've been working in my chapter and then in these working group meetings to look on the backside, pick a species and take a look and explore it. And we've learned so much, and that's what we hope will be the outcome of this webinar regarding budburst, that we can develop a community of CoNPS members who are interested in doing the curation and doing the actual data collection in budburst as well. Okay, so as we think about citizen science as a scholarly pursuit, this is a graph of a literature search, many searches combined, about the mention of citizen science in the scientific community. So remember that I was saying that Thoreau and Leopold and Carson, they kind of like predated science as a real profession, right? And so now we somehow come all the way around full circle, and we're turning back to the citizen observer, and now the scientists want to get back to finding the data collected by the Thoreaus and the Carsons and the Leopolds, and you can see how this scholarly pursuit has increased exponentially, but in just really a very short history. So when Paul was my professor, it was 2001, 2002. So you can see in that year, no one published anything with the term citizen science in it. But now we have hundreds of papers, and I haven't updated this in the last 3 years, but I guarantee you the graph keeps going. So how did this all get started? How does science happen? So one thing that's fascinating to me is that, I was in college in Montana back in the day, and I was like, I'm going to be a Forest Service botanist. But by the time I became credentialed for that, there were no more botany jobs. All the Forest Service jobs were GIS jobs. And so there's this real shift from like physical observation of the landscape to like a technology oriented observation, like remote sensing. And so that kind of happened. And then now a lot of those tertiary or secondary and tertiary employees in Forest Service, so like below, the ranger, they're community engagement specialists, right? So their job is to coordinate us. And how did we get there, right? That citizen science. Well, in 2009, an NSF funding call came out for public participation in scientific research, PPSR. And I mentioned up in Cornell, Rick Bonney and Dickinson, these folks, they wrote the first report, right? They did the first query of public engagement in scientific pursuits, and this gave rise to a funding announcement which funded most of these citizen science pursuits in the last decade. There is no new funding for this, but it's called different things now, you know, but it all is pressing towards informal science education. And we've got to think about this in terms of, again, the big like historical picture. Why would the government care if we're scientifically literate? Well, it sort of goes back to this Cold War fear, really, that, you know, we are falling behind and our science literacy is in decline in the United States, and citizen science is a means to change those tides and to increase interest in science. Plus, of course, our job sectors are increasingly science and technology based, but we have declining interest in those disciplines. So public participation in scientific research is of concern to our government, and we need to feed right into that so the funding keeps coming our way. So who are these people called citizen scientists? They are all kinds of people, indigenous populations, college students, students of all ages, private landowners, nonprofits, scientific researchers. So for example, some of the studies that are have the biggest impact on me regard the indigenous human populations, right? They can collect amazing ecological data without even using a pen and pencil. And the things that are known through observation are as reliable, if not more reliable, than what the scientific researchers can learn about through their scientific pursuits. And then here on the right, you see this picture of, these are Salida students. I used to live in Salida, and we're on the Continental Divide there taking some, I think we're doing some sketching. But children have great potential to enter the environment of citizen science, and Inaturalist and Budburst are both very accessible tools, and we will talk about that more. So what do we do as citizen scientists? Well, bear in mind what climate research looks like. So climate change research, as I mentioned, is really a collection of abiotic and biotic factors. We can measure those things and put them into models to understand how the climate is changing, but it's not a direct measurement. It's really this modeling process, and it requires a great deal of ground truthing. So it's the citizen scientists who can do that, and they do it very effectively because of the scaling opportunities for monitoring. So in our realm, citizen scientists identify species, they measure plant cover, like for example, the health of a rangeland can be determined based on just the percent cover, like just how many plants there are in the landscape covering it. So how much bare ground there is a measure of range health. So imagine that's really easy to measure. And then phenophases, we'll learn all about that. Pollinator visitation, so like in the year I finished my dissertation a couple years ago, 350,000 monarch butterflies have been tagged by volunteers in Mexico all the way up through the United States. So pollinators, we can record diversity, monitor restoration efforts, etc. So I was gonna go over to the SciStarter page right now, but I'm worried about dropping off of my presentation. But Kathy, I'm gonna try this, okay? Tell me if it doesn't work out.
Give it a shot.
Okay. Oh, that just advanced my slides. So let's just go like this. And we'll drop this in here. Okay, so for example, what do citizen scientists do? There's a whole entire organization that just provides the answer to that question. And so SciStarter is a tool that anyone could use to find citizen science opportunities. So say we've just put in plant, okay? Let's see what happens. All right, so I got 57 different activities. There's bud bursts. A lot of these are national or international efforts employing technology, so you don't have to be in a particular place. So you can just see the great diversity of things in just this small category. And then I will note that citizen science does occur in all disciplines. Some of the most interesting citizen science efforts I've seen are like, you can just look at photographs taken by telescopes and just look for galaxies. Citizens have found galaxies. And you can also, in the medical realm, you can just look at medical papers, even if you cannot understand what they say. You're just looking for certain words, certain references to certain medications, to certain illnesses, and this helps meta-analyses occur, where scientists like take stock of all the research that's being done in a particular field. And then as you think about your life potentially as a citizen scientist after this webinar, there are many different ways that you can be involved. And so there's minimal involvement. So this is like distributed computing. Those were the things I gave you examples of in astronomy and medical science. And then we have contributory. So for example, like coming up in Colorado Springs, we're going to have a BioBlitz, and we have BioBlitzes a couple of times a year. They are just opportunities to collect data. Most BioBlitzes occur with Inaturalist, and so you're just contributing photographs. And so this is a novice citizen science engagement, but an extremely important one. And then there's collaborative. So thinking back to those definitions about whether citizen scientists are volunteers or they are working under the guidance of scientists, there are increasingly more engagements that are collaborative. So for example, when I work with citizen scientists, if the land managers have a new question that they want explored, the citizen scientists make the data protocols. They design the protocols and I give them guidance. And so I would call that collaborative. So for example, in my work in the Garden of the Gods, we were measuring like abiotic factors of trail change. So like how deep the trail was, how wide, before and after restoration. And then we're also looking at active revegetation of closed trails. And then the land managers came back and said, well, we want to know if people are actually staying off of those trails. And then one of the citizen scientists, he made a data sheet for that. And we talked to people about it to talk about its validity, and then we use it. And so it's not all coming from my brain, it's a two-way street. And then finally, we have co-created citizen science, and this is really happening a lot in the Pikes Peak region. And so in this way, think about, and also thinking about COVID itself, like the citizens are noticing the problem and they are creating the scientific questions and they are creating the monitoring protocols. So for example, we have PFAs in the wide field aquifer in Fountain, right? And so it's citizens, just like Flint, Michigan, who really are asking questions about whether that's contaminating their residential water, and whether they can garden in their backyards. And that's coming not from the scientists, but from the citizens. Okay, so a big thing about citizen science is like it's adults a lot of the time, and the principles of adult learning are really focused on some important tenets. So for example, if you want to teach anything to an adult, they have to care. Remember that saying, we know about what we care about what we know. So if an engagement, a volunteer engagement, is not personally gratifying or practically meaningful or having a real world context or problem based, adults won't come to the table, or they will and they won't be retained. And so when I was doing my research, you know, this term just kept coming up, like all of this is real world. Like we are doing something extremely important as citizen scientists, and the conservation impacts of our work are almost endless. So we looked at some of these things already, but let me, the Great Sunflower Project, the Botanic Gardens, I do want to go into here. Oh, see, that one worked better. Hold on one second. Okay, so where is this work getting started? For example, it's getting started in Colorado at the Denver Botanic Gardens. So right here, Botanic Gardens phenology work using bud burst, for example. And a lot of our CoNPS folks are also connected to DBG very closely. For example, my graduate lab was there, and also Denise Wilson has worked there, I know, and the Jennifers. So take a look at this. The Botanic Gardens used to be a Botanic Gardens, just what you would think it is. But now, in the last decade or so, a lot of this important citizen science research is coming right through the gardens. It's not coming from academic institution, it's coming from a local nonprofit. So that's very important to bear in mind when you're thinking about how to get involved in science. You might wonder, who do I contact? And then there are also ways, you know, that we have these abiotic measurements that we really need in ecology to compare our biological measurements. And this is one of the coolest things. This is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, CoCoRaHS. And if you're an educator, you might already have a CoCoRaHS weather station at your school or house. But essentially, you're just collecting the abiotic data just like we are with Inaturalist and Budburst, but with CoCoRaHS, then you can join a grassroots volunteer network of backyard weather observers. And so another excellent example, Colorado really is one of the seats of scientific or citizen science pursuits. This, I wanted to show you this too, because your activism might just come right from within you. So this is just the lady's blog. As best I can tell, she's not a scientist, but she really cares about these things. And so she has this WordPress site, and you know, she just started this blog out of personal interest, and she has a YouTube channel. And yeah, she's just getting the word out. She's doing the science communication herself. And I really appreciate that. And so, yeah, then also, this is my website. Some of you have participated in the Rocky Mountain Field Institute Citizen Science Program, but I just invented this. I wanted to write my dissertation about it. And so I started to, you know, engage with Rumphy so that I would have some grounding in my work. And the citizen side, like, petitioned the board, just like I did for CoNPS and the Inaturalist project. And they funded my project for 3 years. And we have completely made trails disappear, and it's just me and CoNPS members and other volunteers going out there and looking at the percent cover on the trail face after active revegetation. So that's all I got for you. That concludes my talk about kind of what is citizen science and where are we, and hopefully I give you some feedback on how you might enact this in your personal lives or with your volunteers. I know CoNPS members are very active in many things, and so I hope I shed some light on the wisdom behind training and engaging citizens in monitoring activities.
Okay, thank you for that very much. We do have a question. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? The question is, Are there any programs geared for younger children that are essentially training for them for growing up to be citizen scientists? This could either be school related or non-school programs.
Yes, for sure. So both Budverse and iNaturalist are awesome for kids because they just need to be able to take a picture. And the fun part is taking the picture, and then there are academic extensions on the backside, you know, especially with Budverse thinking about the phenophases. And then locally, oh wait, where can you tell me where you are in the state? If you're in Colorado at all.
Yeah, she's in Colorado. She is in Arvada.
In Arvada, okay.
Yeah.
So like up in Denver, I would in the American Mountaineering Center are a lot of the conservation nonprofits in Golden. So I would take a look there. I got my career started when I first moved to Colorado after getting my bachelor's. I worked at the Colorado Mountain Club, and we had a youth education program, so I taught field trips. And that would be something that I'd look at in Arvada. And then also finally, I'll say I think you guys still have the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, and that is a tax structure to support these kinds of activities for youth. And so I would look up that SCFD and see about that.
Okay.
May I could just mention something too, that Budburst has been really focused on trying to get school kids involved for quite a long time. They had a program called Budburst Buddies, where kids could go out, and I think if they made 4 observations, then they get a little badge and become a Budburst Buddy. And if you go on the Budburst website, there's a whole section of resources for teachers so that they can use Budburst in the classroom and videos and things like that. So it's something we're really trying hard to do.
Okay, here's a couple more questions for you. In submitting observations into iNaturalist for insects, often one photograph of a flying insect does not allow for full identification. Can multiple photos be submitted to handle this problem?
Yes, we will go into the nuts and bolts of all of that, but that is a great question because I started the iNaturalist thing, and the coolest thing that I learned was that there was Audrey Spencer was a CoNPS member, and she is up in the Denver area, I think, and she has a great explanation on which photographs you should take to make the identifications positively identifiable once you leave the field. So like, for example, I've started to take the underside of leaves, take pictures of the underside of leaves, and also always try to get like the reproductive parts. And as far as bugs and insects and animals, I am not the expert in that field, but you can upload multiple photographs.
Okay, thanks. One more question here. How do observations get verified? And she's talking about correct plant species identification, etc.
So essentially that is a black box right now, both in Budburst and iNaturalist, and that is the purpose of Paul and I having this webinar, really is to incite more interest in doing this curation work. So in iNaturalist, what happens right now is I make an observation and like Kurt tells me I'm wrong or right. He's one of my members, and no, and then other people, like, so your community, they either confirm or deny, and I usually stop at genus unless I've actually gotten out Agrifield and Weber. Sometimes it's a process of elimination. You definitely know based on elevation what it is, but to answer your question, like right now it's just out there to the world, and my dream is that CoNPS becomes that expert base where we're going in, and we are not, like, make no mistake, Kathy did say one thing that was wrong. We are not verifying all observations. I think we got through like 5 in the first working group. 5 observations. And there are millions. So it's a slow process, but I think that the way to get it done is you go in the computer later after you're not in the field anymore, and you just look. And when you follow people, you get emails when they post. So I'm trying to instill a culture where we all follow each other. So if you go on a walk and you put up your pictures and I know you and I know you're a CoNPS member, I'll go to your observations and I'll work on verifying those.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to mention, when I've worked with iNaturalists, I was really, especially for certain groups, like some of the animal groups, I was totally impressed of how many people were involved in verifying observations. I was down in Southern California, area I didn't know very well, intertidal organisms I don't know anything about, and I would take pictures of these things, and their curators from museums would be talking about these specimens, and it was just, made me the idea of potential. Wow, if we could do that with plants, that would be so fantastic. It's kind of like crowdsourcing. If you think of all of the people around Colorado that know a lot about plants, if they participated in this process, it would be a really fantastic way to improve the value of our data and also make them aware of these really cool observations that are being made. Even as somebody who knows nothing about intertidal, I got a range extension of a major species when I was down there. And that's the whole point of it, I guess. It's a cool thing, very exciting.
Okay, thank you. The next question is probably for Paul. Has Budburst tried to connect with Girl Scouts to create a badge?
I don't know. That's a great question. I should ask the national office about that. I know there's a lot of discussion about Boy Scout badges for these kinds of things. That's a really great idea, and I know some local chapters have been doing that. Yeah, that's a great idea. That's something you could start in your area, and the national office could help define that. But I know that's a great idea, because I know a lot of parents are saying some of these badges are going for like video games and technology stuff. We need more badges for being outside and observing nature, and both iNaturalist, Budburst could be really perfect for that.
Okay, a couple more questions here. Can we use Ackerfield's Flora of Colorado for definitive geographic data and verification?
I think yes. I mean, from my novice experience with Ackerfield, I have been talking about this with my chapter a lot. And I think there's been a lot of work done to verify the geography. But if you see something that you think is wrong, I've also heard that she's really open to like taking feedback, And I'm just gonna go out for a second because this is something that Audrey, she couldn't be here today, but Audrey, Spencer, and I will be together running these INAT meetings. And she told me about this SciNet. So this is, oh no, that's not it. Sorry. It's it's all the herbaria specimen. So this is kind of a neat way to verify the geography, is to look at the herbaria specimen, and you can add this as another layer, of your investigation.
Okay, one last question here. It says, is there guidance for the photos for correct plant identification available on iNaturalist?
Like which photos to take?
It just says, are the guidance for photos for correct plant identification available on iNaturalist? Is there some kind of guidance that you use for taking the photos?
Oh, just what Audrey told me. Honestly, I haven't noticed anything on the INAT webpage about how to take the photos. Here's what I've learned. I've been trying to go out with both Weber and Ackerfield, and essentially, like their go-to splits are different parts of the plant. So if I could just say something in summary, I would say take as many pictures as you can, and not the ones that you're going to print out and put in a frame on the wall. It's like, how hairy is it? Because they always ask about that, you know, and what are the reproductive parts doing, and what's the underside of the leaf or the leaf margin, you know? Those are the kinds of things that they're asking about. And so that, I think, is the best way to get into better photography, is to just do more keying.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And in the Budburst website, for example, they encouraged people to take a close-up picture of the flower, but also to take a picture of the whole plant. I was working with naturalists in Larimer County on this, and that was a common problem, that just like Maggie said, people like to take beautiful pictures of flowers, but for a lot of plants, the flower doesn't actually help in a lot of the identification. You really need to know the arrangement of leaves. You need to know the shape and pattern of the plant and things like that. So taking a picture of the whole plant, the general character of the plant and the leaf patterns, and then close-ups of the underside of the flower, in the case of sunflowers in particular. You know, again, like Maggie's saying, it depends on the keys, but in general, having some close-ups of the flower parts above and below is usually not what you take a picture of, but that's often extremely important. And the general character of the plant, the arrangement of leaves, that really helps a lot. And I was going to mention too, the thing that's sort of remarkable about just even an iPhone, a smartphone, you know, even the most simple cameras we have, you can blow those up and get unbelievable detail, you know, much better than what you normally could see in a 10x lens. So they're really quite remarkable for some of these features, like hairiness we mentioned, patterns of hairs and structure. It's kind of incredible. So just having a digital camera is an unbelievable tool for plant ID these days.
Okay, we have a comment here about SignNet. It says SignNet is handy, but those observations are also not necessarily verified.
That's a great comment. I am totally new to it. It just seemed like another piece of the puzzle to add to the identification. In iNaturalist, there's also like the Global Biodiversity Index, and you can, it's like a GBIF, and it's a little box, and you can click that as well, and it adds more observations to your map from the Global Biodiversity Index. And so I understand that none of these are perfect, but if you saw it in SciNet and you saw it in GBIF and iNaturalist said it was seen nearby, you know, then those three things might lead you to conclude that you were right in your identification or wrong.
I should mention one other thing here. Another approach we've taken in Budburst, because this is a really tough problem, as everybody knows, is try to key out a plant. It's not that easy, and it's good to have a lot of people involved. The other approach is, you know, to get really good information in plant phenology, what we ideally would like was have a lot of people observing the same plant, but in different places. And then you can really understand the relative influence of climate. So the idea of emphasizing really common, easy to identify plants is another way to solve the ID problem. I mean, I think everybody recognizes what a blue columbine looks like. You're not going to confuse it with anything else. And if everybody made observations of these kind of, if we could agree on what are, you know, say the 50 or 100 most common iconic plants here in Colorado that are all very easy to identify, then that data could be really valuable, because we still need to do all the verification stuff, but it's going to be a lot easier. And that's where there's a little difference between, I think, iNaturalist and Budburst. Budburst actually benefits from data on really common plants. It doesn't have to be a new species. It just really common plants provide really value. Even weeds, actually, phenology in weeds is actually quite important. And so that's another approach, is to try to emphasize some common plants that people would normally, that would be the plants people would notice. You go walking in a trail, you know, there's these really beautiful flowers that everybody notices. Well, if we had collected data on those, that would be great. That would be a great contribution. So that's another approach to this.
And
okay, sorry, go ahead.
Can I just add to that? So as a ecologist who loves to garden, like I feel like budburst is the thing that I'm gonna do most in my garden, because that's where the phenology, I'm so interested in it the most. But also then I can focus on the same species repeatedly.
Right,
Yeah.
botanical gardens do that. I think the Denver Botanical Garden, that's one of the programs they have. The volunteers actually keep close track of the phenology of the plants in the gardens. There's a long history of some of our best phenology is from gardens, absolutely, because you can make easy daily observations.
Just a couple of comments here. It says BONAP, B-O-N-A-P, query page can pull up maps of species to help in the ID. And it's included with a web address. So I can put that in the browser for people so they can copy that. And there's another comment here. It says, if you are concerned about SciNet observations, just use the big four: DBG, CSU, CU, and Rocky Mountain Herbaria. Specimens are not entered into the database until the ID is confirmed by herbarium personnel. Thank you, Anne, for that comment. That is all we have right now as far as questions and comments. So if you want to go ahead and take it away, Paul.
Okay, thanks. Okay, why don't we go to the next slide?
Oops, sorry.
Oops. Yeah, those are the theme of budbursts we talked about. Timing is everything. You know, when you think of a plant or an animal in nature, knowing when to do things is incredibly important. And so this is the whole idea of phenology science, is to understand how plants and animals and other phenomena in nature, how they figure out when they're going to do things and what that can tell you about the environment. Let's go to the next slide. Oh yeah. So this funny word, phenology, it's a science of appearance. So, you know, basically you're looking at when things appear. And this is what we're talking about. And there's lots of things that fall in this category. And these are things that people have been noting since the very beginning of time. You know, knowing, you know, humans are pretty good at looking at flowers, and a lot of anthropologists have thought that, well, maybe part of that was a part of foraging and survival. Knowing about flowers, you know where the fruit are going to come, and it's a good way of knowing about food and foraging. So it's been a long, and actually agriculture has been a heavy user of phenology information before we even knew there was such a thing as phenology science. So we're talking about, when do flowers first appear in the spring? That's a really valuable phenology observation. That's what we do a lot of. When do the first leaves come out and the unrolling of leaves? The arrival of birds in the spring. We've documented amazing changes in bird migration with this kind of information. When does ice breakup occur in rivers and lakes? This is something Thoreau was always writing a lot about in his journals. And then in the fall, the turning of leaves is also something that's a function of climate. Let's go on to the next one. Yeah, so why do we study plant phenology? It's a relatively new science, at least it's relatively new at being well recognized. I mean, the big focus on phenology started in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we started realizing it was so important for climate change. But if the thing about it as a naturalist, what's really amazing about doing phenology is it's an incentive to go out in the field all the time. In a regular, instead of going to a trail once in a while, going to the trail every week. It's unbelievable what a difference you'll see in documenting your natural environment. You know, I had a little trail near my house in Missoula. I'd go out there about every 4 days. And after a year or so, I had like 200 species within about 6 feet of the trail. And people were blown away, because most people would only see 5 or 10 species or something at any given time. But if you follow it very carefully, you'll see all these species that come and go very quickly that you might not notice if you're not there all the time. So it's a really great way of seeing a lot more diversity out there. Great way to learn about microclimate. If you're starting to look at when flowers come out, you might notice in your yard or a park, gee, in the shade of this tree, the flowers are coming out a little bit earlier or a little bit later. There must be a little cold air drainage here. The plants are a little bit later in this little pocket. So it's, you know, they're like mini weather stations. You know, they're telling you very subtle effects of climate that you might not otherwise know about. And of course, this is why it's very important for agriculture, because then you know a lot more about your area and how plants will grow in your area. Yeah, and then traditionally, and even today, you know, like, you know, you can think of like here in Colorado, you know, you could say, okay, there's certain dates, like we might say, the St. Patrick's Day is when you should plant your potatoes, or Mother's Day is when you should put your tomatoes out, you know. And in Colorado, that doesn't work very often, you know, depends on whether there's a snowstorm or not, you know, and actually using plants like for potatoes, saying, okay, when the dandelions start flowering, okay, that's when the soil is about 40 degrees and that's a good time to plant potatoes. That's a lot better than saying it's March 27th or something. So it's been used extensively in agriculture in very sophisticated ways, which I'll explain in a few minutes. And then, but of course, what's really brought this the whole fore that what we're doing with now is it's a fantastic way of looking at climate change. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were starting, you know, we talked a lot about the theory of climate change. We knew a lot about it, but we weren't sure we were actually seeing the effects of climate change yet. And that's when phenology really came to the fore. They said, wow, this could be the way we could really document if climate change is occurring right now. And that's what was the impetus for the foundation of the National Phenology Network, as well as Budburst and other things. So that's been a real impetus, but it has all these other benefits as well. Okay, next. This is one of my favorite examples of historical phenology. You know, in agriculture, you keep track of a lot of things. And of course, you know, people are quite obsessive about grapes and wine. And so they keep unbelievable records. I remember talking to some of these vintners in these limestone caves in France. It had, you know, 10 generations of their family have been growing grapes in this particular place. Well, they're just amazing. So they always kept track of the harvest dates of their grapes. In this case, back to 1370. I mean, Maggie said, oh, phenology has been going on for a couple centuries. Well, actually, more like a millennium. And yeah, and then with these dates, they were so accurate that actually we're able to reconstruct temperature patterns in central France back to the Middle Ages with this data. So it's kind of phenomenal for looking, and there's other examples, just like tree rings, basically. So it's an incredible way of understanding variations in climate and weather. Next. Okay, so this is the fundamental question I think is really kind of interesting to think about. You know, think of if you're a plant growing in Colorado, how are you going to figure out when you should start growing? Because if you put out your leaves too early, you're going to get nailed by some crazy snowstorm or frost event or something like that. And if you're too conservative and you just wait too long until it's really totally safe, you start growing, then you're way behind all the other plants. You're not going to be a very good competitor. So figure out when to start growing and when to put out your flowers. Of course, with the flowers, it has to be when the pollinators are there. It's really kind of complicated. And there's a couple of different ways they can do it. One way that we sometimes think should be the way they do it is like we think of calendar dates a lot. And we know some birds do this and some plants do it. They say, okay, and May 22nd is when I'm going to start putting out leaves. Or, you know, we had a lazuli bunting in Montana that on a particular date in May was when they would arrive, no matter what, if it's a snowstorm or not. But that seems like kind of a very crude way of doing things. You're not going to be right very often that way. On average, maybe, but you can have a lot of mistakes. Now, what if you started growing depending on how warm it was? Now that starts making a lot more sense, especially in a place like Colorado. Well, if it's a really cold spring, you know, you're gonna wait a little while until you start growing. If we had a really warm spring like this year, then you could start growing earlier. And if you had a way of measuring temperature, you could do that. And then if you're in a dry climate, especially in deserts and areas like that, the growing season is actually defined by rainfall, not temperature. And so when you have a rain event, then that's when things start growing. So it's kind of interesting. It depends on your environment a little bit at what it is. And this little graph shows, you know, that's how basically plants figure out calendar dates is the calendar date. In each calendar date, you're going to have a different number of hours of sunlight and darkness. And so that's how a plant, so by knowing the hours of sunlight or darkness, you know what the date is, basically. That's how that works. And chemically, plants can do that. It's really kind of cool. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so temperature is the thing that plants really seem to key on in our area in particular, not in the tropics, but in our area, air temperature is a really important trigger for when plants are going to come out. The day length has problems because of variability from year to year, especially now with the crazy variability weather we're seeing. And in some cases, rainfall accumulation can change that a little bit. But you can see in this map, you know, the average air temperature is really different, and that corresponds with when plants come out. So that kind of makes sense. Next slide. But there's a problem, you know, if you measure, especially here in Colorado, if any of you that have a home weather station or something, or you watch the weather channel a lot, the variation in daily temperature can be kind of crazy. You can have a 40 or 50 degree range in some cases from day to day. And so that's, you know, plants can't react that quickly. That doesn't make too much sense. That what you really need is to average out that variation to look at a trend. And that's what a running mean is. You're basically taking the average over several days in a row and looking at the trend. And that works pretty well. And the ultimate, I won't get into all the details, but the ultimate way of doing this was discovered a while ago. And that's a measurement that's called growing degree days. And basically what you're doing is you're accumulating the number of degrees the temperature is on the average temperature given day, how many degrees it is above a certain level. And that gives you a measure of the cumulative energy that's available over time. The same thing is used to figure in your heating bill. You see heating degree days does the same kind of thing. So it's a very cool way of mathematically using temperature data translating into energy, which is what plants are responding to. Next slide. Yeah, here's an example. Here's a daily temperature in green. So it's going all over the place. So you can't really predict things very well. But if you do a 20-day running mean average, then you see this very clear pattern. You can visualize that it's accumulating energy over time. And at a certain point, the plant is going to say, okay, there's enough energy now. There's been enough in the atmosphere over time. Now is a pretty good time to start growing, and I'll put out leaves and hope that it doesn't snow the next day. Okay, next slide. And this is one of my favorite examples. This is done a long time ago. But you know, if you're a gardener or a farmer, it would be incredibly valuable if you could know when your harvest is going to be ready. You know, and you can use calendar date, but it's a kind of a wild guess. And so they would put out, and this in the old days when it was harder, but they would, in these orchards, they would put in their own weather stations, and they would record temperature every few minutes, average it over an hour and over the day, and then calculate the energy over time with growing degree hours. And they could actually predict when the peaches would ripen within a day or two. It's just phenomenal. So that means if you're knowing what the trend is, you can predict exactly when the peaches are ripe, and you can organize all the labor and everything for harvest. And so, but isn't that incredible that it's that precise a relationship? And it really is. So it's kind of remarkable how we can predict these things now. Next slide. Yeah, so you say, well, this is kind of cool scientific fact. So what's the big deal? If plants are like weather stations, why don't you just put out weather stations? And of course, weather stations are cheap now, but there's a lot of reasons where they're better than just having a weather station. You can use, they're much cheaper, more practical, and they integrate the weather over time. Like I said, the daily temperature doesn't tell you that much. What you want to know is these trends, and they integrate things in a very simple way. And so by looking at plant phenology, you can look at very small differences in climate all over the landscape. So incredibly important for conservation. And for habitats, if you're looking for rare species, the plant phenology can be a way to identify different microclimates where you might want to look at different species. And of course, you're going to see variation in phenology from year to year. And so it's a great way of looking at variation in climate, not only spatially across the country, across a landscape, but also over time. And then from a practical standpoint, like I was mentioning, as a gardener, you know, in fact, when I was a master gardener up in Montana, and you have to do it like a volunteer project to be a master gardener. And since I was doing all this phenology stuff, my project was I developed some of the phenological patterns so they could put it in their calendar for figuring out when pests should be emerging, when you should be worrying about controlling different kinds of pests on fruit trees and things like that. And you know, it's just an incredibly practical thing for anybody who's interested in growing plants or agriculture. And then also it's kind of fun too for cocktail conversations. Two people say, gee, isn't it early spring this year? And I say, well, on my phone it says it's about 4 days early according to my observations so far. You know? So you can really really zero in on, you know, is it really early spring or not, and what are the patterns? It's a great way of really understanding how plants are responding to weather variation. Next slide. So when I was teaching in Montana, my house was at the base of Mount Sentinel, this mountain there, which was a open space natural area more or less, and had strong elevational gradient. But anyway, it was nearby, and I was like a new professor. I was an expert in rainforest, so I didn't know that much about the local plants. So I said, well, maybe a good way to do it would be like Thoreau or something. I'll just choose a trail, and I'll walk this trail every couple of days, and then identify everything I see in the trail. And I did that, and after about 12 years of doing that, keeping track of a couple hundred species, I started looking at the pattern in relation to climate. I put a bunch of weather stations along the trail and stuff so I could document the climate. And one of our most iconic species was the buttercup, the sagebrush buttercup, beautiful plant. Everybody notices it in the spring. And so I kept observations on that, and lo and behold, I found that I could predict within a couple of days when the buttercups would bloom just based on the air temperature. So that was kind of, given all the variability that could influence when things flower and all the, you know, microclimate and soils and everything else, it was kind of remarkable to me how consistent these relationships are. In terms of climate variation, one of the important phenomena we see in a lot of places is variations in the ocean, the El Nino, La Nina cycle. And in the area I was making my phenology observations, that was really important in Montana. By keeping track of, I thought this was kind of cool, by keeping a track of plants in my backyard, basically, in my little area, keeping careful record of them, you could actually follow the pattern of the El Nino La Nina cycle. You could actually see that cycle reflected in the data. So here by just looking at plants in your backyard, you can actually see how they're being affected by the Pacific Ocean. I thought that was kind of cool, even though I was 1,000 miles away. So it's just a neat way, just by making simple observations of when these plants are coming out, when they're putting out flowers, gives you a understanding of how these plants are responding to all these different scales of environmental influences. It's just kind of cool. I mean, that's why I always feel like a lot of people like cute animals, and you have a hard time getting them interested in plants. And I keep on trying to say plants are incredibly smart when you think of they're kind of stuck in a particular place, and they've got to somehow figure out how to survive with no water, no fertilization, nobody taking care of them, animals eating them, and it's just remarkable how they can take environmental cues and use that to make decisions on when to flower, when to fruit, how many leaves to put out this year, how big they're going to be. We think of that as all fixed. It isn't. Plants have an amazing ability to change their growth and architecture to adapt to their growing conditions. You know, whether it be changes in climate, changes in nutrients, changes in season, it's just kind of remarkable. And that's what I think is kind of exciting about this whole field. As an ecologist, I think of, oh, really good data is going out there, like Maggie was saying, and getting data on the relative abundance of hundreds of species to understand what your community is or something like that. Very difficult to do, but you know, a lot of good information. And that seems incredibly simple, just to note the date of when the flower comes out. What can you do with that? Well, we found out we actually can do a lot. And sometimes simple is beautiful. You know, these simple observations that we all can make, we're finding are really valuable because they're accurate. Like Maggie is saying, you can all agree on when the columbine is in flower. You know, there isn't a lot of debate over that. It's in flower, you know, and so lots of people can make that observation. And now scientists are learning so many incredible things they can do with this kind of data. So here's the pattern with El Nino. What you're seeing here is the black line is like the average flowering date for the 102 species I was monitoring there. And so the squiggly line is showing variations from year to year on the average flowering date. And so we'd have really, really early dates during El Nino patterns. That's when we'd have kind of a warm, dry spring. And so you'd see a big change in all these species in when they were flowering. They're picking up the cue that this is a warm season. Okay, let's flower early. Let's produce a lot more seeds this year. Let's get a competitive advantage. And then when it's not an El Nino year, they would hold off. And so it was just kind of cool that you could see this pattern with this very simple data that collected in a very consistent way. And I should point out that I couldn't be there all the time to make these observations, you know, during the whole growing season. And so there were 2 or 3 of us that worked as a team. And together, you know, somebody goes on vacation, the other person can cover for them. And that's what I think, you know, if you really wanted to have really good data on a trail or something, if you just had a chapter adopted and had a few people watching it, you could get really incredible data because you would have the consistency. You wouldn't have any gaps. Okay, next slide. Thinking about this earlier, this was an incredibly important study when it came back way back in 2002. So this is the very beginning, just before Budburst started. You know, remember I was saying that people were saying, gee, I wonder if climate change is already affecting what we're seeing. There was a big debate about that. They said, oh, that's way in the future. It's a theory or whatever. And people had been collecting all this phenology data for many years. All these naturalists, scientists were getting the data. They compiled it together, and it was kind of remarkable. So look at this. And this is not just Colorado or even the US, it's across the world. Okay, for plants, Europe and North America, we had great phenology data. By looking at the previous 30 to 50 years, we were seeing that plants are flowering an average of 1.5 to 3 days earlier each 10 years. So it wasn't just the last decade, it's a long-term pattern. And of course, it was increasing over time. And we're seeing the same thing in butterflies in terms of what they're arriving with their migration. And you've probably heard, you know, the bird watchers with that Cornell program that Maggie mentioned, they have done a great job of documenting changes in bird migration. And birds are migrating hundreds of miles further north than they did before, and then they're arriving earlier in their spring. Some birds are arriving, some birds, like I said, have a calendar date thing going on, and they're still doing it. But in general, we're seeing this incredibly consistent pattern of spring is becoming earlier all over the world, and especially since the late 70s, you know, so that was generated a lot of interest, and this is what gave the rise to a lot of these phenology programs. You realize, wow, we really should be watching this. This is an incredibly sensitive and important way of documenting climate change all around the world. Now, these buttercups, everybody knew about the buttercups coming on the spring. That was kind of the sign of spring. And the newspapers sometimes say on this particular calendar day, this is when the buttercups are supposed to come out, you know, and then, you know, which is usually like in March. the middle of March was the average date. Well, one year, I saw buttercups in flower on January 17th. You know, and so this is what's going on. The climate is kind of crazy lately. And by looking at plant phenology, you may see some very unusual things. And these are really important. You know, in science, we always talk about it. We're always focused on what's the average and the mean and all that kind of stuff. But we learn a lot about the exceptions. It's incredibly important to know about that rare species that you just discovered in some watershed, or we're talking about geography. The first observing a species where it's not supposed to be is incredibly important for understanding science. And the same way in phenology, looking at, wow, can these things really occur in January? That tells us a lot about the genetics of the plant, of how the genes work for turning on the phenology. You know, and we can go into the details more, but this was a really cool observation. We realized, no, it isn't day length thing at all. It's just temperature. For these buttercups, doesn't matter what the day length is. If it's following on January 17th, it's strictly following soil temperature, it turns out. Next slide. And this, I think, is, to me, one of the most important reasons why it's important to have people observing plant phenology in their neighborhoods across the country. It's not why it's not just the same as a weather station. All these plants and animals have different cues that they use to figure out when they should arrive in spring or when they should start growing. Well, if the climate is changing and the environment is changing, these cues might be changing in a different pattern. So sometimes you have what we call an ecological mismatch. You know, what would have worked perfectly in the past in terms of a cue for the best time to arrive in spring, all of a sudden doesn't work because the pattern of warming in spring is different. So the great example was from Europe, this bird called the great tit. It's sort of like a chickadee. It would arrive in the spring at a particular calendar date that generally corresponded when the leaves that came out and there was a lot of caterpillars eating the leaves of its food plant. So it was kind of a perfect time to be there, and it was really important to have a good food source because it needs a lot of energy for its nestlings and nesting season, all that kind of stuff. Well, it turns out it was using the calendar date. The plant was using temperature. So the plant started earlier, and by the time the bird had arrived, there weren't as many caterpillars. So there was a mismatch. And we're seeing that with a number here in Colorado. We've documented that in the Rocky Mountain Labs near Crested Butte. Been a lot of studies of this. And so that's where it becomes really important. Let's keep track of the phenology. See, are we starting to have mismatches? In other words, are some species adapting to climate change much more rapidly and better than others? And that gives an identification for conservation. Maybe there's some species that are going to be in trouble over time. You know, they're not adapting to these weather changes as well as other species, and their food sources are, you know, anyway. So it's really important for conservation to understand, are these complex relationships between animals and plants, insects and plants, are they changing? And is that something we should be watching to make sure we can conserve these species in the future? Okay, next. Next. And this is a great example. It's gotten a lot of publicity in recent years. One of my colleagues in Montana, Scott Mills, has done a lot of studies on snowshoe hares. He was interested in population dynamics and, you know, these patterns, very famous patterns known in ecology, how they vary greatly over time with their food source. And then they all of a sudden started realizing, well, you know what's weird about this? This is such a cool natural history thing. Isn't this an amazing adaptation? A snowshoe hare is white in the wintertime when there's snow, so it's beautifully camouflaged because they get eaten by all these different kinds of animals. And then in the summer, when the plants come out and the earth is green, then they turn brown and they're perfectly camouflaged. What a really cool thing. But then you have to start asking the question, well, how does it know when it should change the color of its fur? And it turns out it's calendar date. It uses day length. And so what's happening in the Rockies as well as back east and other parts of the world, the climate's changing. You know, the snowpack is not what it used to be. The snowpack is melting very early, you know, like it's been doing this year in Colorado. And so all of a sudden you've got a white rabbit in a green landscape, and they're pretty easy for an eagle or some other animal to find and eat. And so they find that there's a mismatch with the environmental cue, and so they're you know, realizing we need to really understand these things. How do these plants and animals know when it's spring? Which ones are ones that are going to get into trouble because of this change in climate? So it's just another reason for it's so valuable to understand these patterns. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and so this is one of the things we, as Budburst volunteers, can help scientists understand, which will be incredibly important for conservation, for gardening, for all kinds of things. That, you know, some of these plants are going to be varying from year to year based on temperature patterns and keying into it really well, and some won't. And trying to identify how these plants are adapting or not adapting to climate change is going to be really, really important to understand. Yeah, and so that's I think one of the more exciting things we're learning, and you'll see that when you do your regular observations, you're going to notice these patterns. It's really, really quite fascinating. And of course, the bad news is, as you might expect, weeds are really good at adapting to climate change. You know, they change their genetics very rapidly. They have short life cycles. They're genetically diverse, and if the native species are not adapting really well to climate change, that in some cases that's a big plus for weeds taking over. So it's another thing to be watching. Next slide. So what can we learn about, you know, what's the value of doing this kind of work? Well, scientifically, there's a lot of really important questions I've already alluded to, but what's really exciting about programs like Project Budburst is that they're national. And in a lot of ways, we're hoping that this work that we're doing here in Colorado will help inspire other people in other states and other regions, you know. But right now we have observers and Budburst in every state of the country making observations. So we're uniquely able to answer this question. Is this just a local thing? This is just a Front Range thing? Or is this all of Colorado? Or is this the whole country? And not only that, how does it vary region by region? As you might imagine, in the southern United States, there's a really different pattern of climate change than you'd have up here. They're not dealing with snowpack. The rainfall changes are important, the summer rainfall patterns, and so on. You know, every place is a little different. And by having volunteers across the country, we can really understand this pattern in a much greater way than any single scientist could do in any particular study. And then, like I said, it helps us identify species of concern for conservation and also understand their basic ecology. And these mismatches, we need to understand these things. That's a really important thing. Like, studies of insects are equally important, those of plants and birds, to figure these things out. And then also, with iNaturalist as well as Budburst, we're in a position to document species changes. Again, we were talking about geography. Well, species are changing very rapidly. And, you know, I noticed that in my studies in Montana, and I know people are finding that here in Colorado too. The species are moving around. And having more people outside looking at plants is a great way of documenting these changes. Next slide. Next. Ah, there we go. All right. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay,
I should say too, before we break, during the break, what I'd like everybody to try to do is just take a few minutes, and if you could go outside and look at a plant, And I think we provided that form for making a bud burst observation, which basically you're just writing down the location and what the phenophase is. Is it in full flower, or the flower is just beginning to come out, or is fruit, if you can identify the stage, then you can fill that out, and then we can talk, because next, after the break, we're going to talk about how to actually make a bud burst observation. So anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, all right. So we have a question here from Hazel. Can you elaborate on the relationship of El Nino events to the following season's bud set or other related phenomena? What is the lag time in this regard?
Oh, that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting question. I was just looking at the seasonal pattern. You could look at what El Nino was that year. That affected the temperature of that season. That affected the phenology of the plants. But that's true. There's a whole other thing that you have to measure a different way, because bud set generally occurs later in the season. And so it would be a different weather pattern later in the season could affect seed set. And I know for some species, especially like, I remember I was studying fruit for a while, and that was incredibly important. There was a lag time of, I was studying like blueberries, and the temperatures in July when the buds were being set for the next year had a huge relationship in what the fruit production was the following year. So that's a great point. That's another aspect of climate that influences plant behavior. And that's, I don't think we can get at that through phenology directly, but that's a great point. The weather affects plant during its entire life cycle, not just flowering and fruit production. It also affects lag time. So that's what keeps us busy. These are complicated relationships.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Since weedy species adapt well or faster, does bud burst include weeds?
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. And that's why, we really want people to record that, because the weeds are genetically diverse and they can be different in one area than another. So knowing what it's doing in your area is really important. So yes, we'd love for people to keep track of weeds in general. That absolutely. And then that's part of it that I was trying to emphasize with iNaturalists. I think there's a tendency we want to look at really cool rare species, and we want to in bud burst too. But actually, the common things in your garden are very important as well, and weeds are a great example of that, because they're changing very rapidly, and knowing the phenology is, I think, quite helpful in better understanding that.
Okay, we have a comment here from Anne. She says, CoNPS has set up a quote-unquote classroom on the bud burst with our own curated list of Colorado natives. Send an email to budburstcolorado@gmail.com for more information or to join. And I think, are you going to elaborate more on that later, Paul?
Unfortunately, I'm not involved in that. That sounds fantastic. That's exactly what we want to be doing. And so this is what's great about this. I'm learning more about what people are doing. That sounds excellent. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess on that topic, I guess I should mention that I've been talking to the National Bud Burst Office as we're organizing this webinar. And one thing I'm very excited about is they said the plans are to do what was just mentioned, is to use the website, and bud burst is evolving, and eventually it's going to be kind of like iNaturalist, since you put in your photos, which you can do right now, and that will have a process where those photos will go off to groups like was described for Colorado, where a group of people will be going over those photos and trying to verify identification so we can get research grade observations. So I think that's what everybody's saying. That's kind of what we need. And that's exactly where it's going. And I think we'll see in the next year, in fact, there'll be an iPhone app coming out for bud burst. I think that's going to make it a lot easier to make these observations. And we're going to be really trying to get a better handle on data quality and getting more and more people to do a curation of observations. So that's what I think is so exciting about this effort that people are doing here in Colorado, that I think we're doing what we're hoping will happen across the country soon, that all these people that have special expertise and knowledge on local plants will help lend their expertise so we can get better data for iNaturalist and budbursts and other projects. So I'm really glad to hear that. I'll definitely follow up on that. That sounds great to know that's happening.
Okay, great. Those are all the questions we have right now.
Okay.
Paul, do you want to explain the break and also what you'd like them to do on the break?
Well, I mentioned it before, and I'll say again, yeah, you got in your email, you got a form for making a budburst observation. And it isn't that complicated really, but if in your break you go outside and look at a plant, just choose a plant, identify it if you can, and then know what's its phenological stage. You know, is it in full flower? Is it just beginning to flower? Is it done flowering and maybe you're starting to see the first fruits? Just see what is its phenological situation. And then you can come back and maybe, and we'll talk about how to make budbird observations after the break. And then maybe after this webinar, you could actually submit that observation to budburst. So that way you really get experience of how to do all this. So try that, and it can be a weed, like we just said. It doesn't have to be a wilderness area. You know, you can, you should be able to find a plant somewhere during your break, and just try to do that. And I think that make it more valuable when I start talking about making a budburst observation. So look forward to talking about that after the break. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Now let's talk about actually doing citizen science and making a budburst observation. I hope you found a good plan, and it was you could figure out what its phenophase was. It just takes a little bit of time to get used to that. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. Now, one of the things I think is exciting about the Native Plant Society getting involved with budbursts is, you know, I think when I've been involved with other native plant societies, we had all these great field trips, and we go on these trails and we would have these amazing species lists of where we had identified everything on the trail. And if we just took a little bit of extra time and noted the phenological phase, then that would have been fantastic data for budburst, because you have a location, a time, and really good ID, because you got a bunch of people looking at these plants to make sure you had the ID figured out. So making observations along the trail is a great way to use Project Budburst. You're doing what you already do, but getting even more information out of it by adding phenological data. Next slide. Yeah, so phenophases are the big thing we need to deal with to make a phenological observation. So first, you learn how to identify the plant with iNaturalist and other things that you're doing. And now the additional thing is to figure out, you know, what's the stage, the phenological stage a given plant is in. And fortunately, I think most people will be making observations on wildflowers, and wildflowers have very few stages, so it's really simple and straightforward. For shrubs and trees, you have many different stages. This is a serviceberry, which is really common up in Montana, a little bit less so here. And I thought this one was a great one to show all the different stages. And in the Budburst website, they have a section on getting started where they explain all the different stages, all the definitions, have a lot of photos, they have videos, all this kind of stuff. But, you know, like I said, for wildflowers, it isn't too bad to figure out the stages. But basically what we're talking about is, okay, if you're looking at shrubs that have all these different stages, you start out in the winter and you can see the buds. And sometimes the buds will change color, like in the case of the serviceberry, it will start turning red in the late part of winter as it's kind of awakening up, getting ready. And then at a certain point, the buds swell, and you can see green under the bud scales as the bud scales are spreading apart. And so that's the beginning of what we'd call the bud burst stage. And then first leaf, there's a couple, bud burst now is a couple more of these stages. Basically, the next category are phenophase relating to leaves. So first you have the leaves unrolling, just coming out and unrolling. Then they're flat and fully formed. That's the stage we call first leaf, which I think is easy to define. That's why we started out with that stage. Now we have an unrolling stage too, which is a little harder to tell when it exactly is in this stage. And then the next stage is you note when all the leaves have unrolled. So they're fully open. And then for flowers, in this particular plant puts out leaves first and then flowers. Some plants it's flowers first. But anyway, then you have the first flower stage where you see a few flowers on the tree. You know, usually only, in the case of the shrub, usually only 2 or 3 branches or something. You'll see some flowers forming. So then you're in that first flower stage. And then when you get up to about half or more of the flowers are open, then we'll call it the full flowering stage. Next. Yeah, and then you can continue into the fall. So the thing that's kind of, you know, I always think is kind of cool about this, especially in our vegetation, Colorado, we have a lot of grassy open areas. And in these grassy open areas, there are so many different plants that have so many different phenologies that it seems like you can pretty much, I did this at a local open space in Loveland, Devil's Backbone is where I've taken a lot of my phenological observations. And I could pretty much find a new phenological stage every time I went there every week for the entire growing season from spring to fall. It was really kind of cool. But yeah, so there's a lot of fall stages too. So you have the end of flowering, which is kind of hard to do because to know the real end of flowering, you have to make really regular observations to know, did it just happen or did it stop a month ago, you know? First ripe fruit, usually it's the color of the fruit is a really good key that it's ripe. In the case of the serviceberry, when the berries turn this dark blue purple, that's when they're ripe. And that's when I would say it's the first. And you can tell it's the first fruit stage here because you have all the ones that aren't quite ripe. So you can tell they're just starting to ripen. And that's the thing about this is the most valuable observation is where you're figuring out a pheno stage that the plant just got to. You know, it hasn't been the stage for an unknown period of time. It just got to that stage. And so that's why like the first flower or a few flowers is a really good thing to note because that happens very quickly. And so then you know exactly when that happened. And the first ripe fruit is that way too. You know when it's just starting to ripen. So you got a very precise measurement of exactly when it's ripening. Whereas once they're fully ripe, they might be fully ripe for months. And then, you know, it's hard to know when it started. And then you have leaf color. You know, you have the first leaves turning, and then you have half. Again, when you have half of them turning, then we call that full leaf turn. And so that works really well. You can get fooled by some of these things, you know, like sometimes we get these extreme hot days, stressful conditions in the summer, and sometimes you'll see leaves turning color in the middle of the summer, which is not the stage. That's something that's due to stress. It's not really, so there's some judgment involved in this, you know, to get this right. Anyway, next slide. Yeah, so to participate, it's for those who've done iNaturalist, I think there's a lot of similarities. First thing you need to do is just get onto their website. It's just Google Budburst, and budburst.org should come up. And it's sponsored by the Chicago Botanical Garden, actually. You'll see that little insignia on the sign. We were just talking about botanical gardens. They're very important in Budburst. They'll come up, and then then you can register. Come up with the password and everything, and then you're all set. And then you can start making observations. And there's two different ways you can go. I think I'm going to start out with, let's try simple, and you can take this to whatever level of complexity you want. But the simplest thing to do is to make what I think you just did in break, is what's called a one-time observation. You just go out and you observe a plant somewhere, you take a picture of it, and the picture actually, if you have an iPhone, or depending on your camera, but some cameras, they'll give the locational information. So if you take a picture, it automatically figures out the location and the time. So all you have to do is then write down what the species is and what the phenophase was, okay? And then you can submit that to the budburst. There's another way you can do that, and that is to choose a trail, or say a site like your garden or something. Say you're just going to make weekly observations in your garden, and then you use another protocol, which is called life cycle, where you're making regular observations, and those are scientifically extremely valuable, because then you really know exactly when it got to a particular phenophase, usually within a week. So that's super valuable. But anyway, so there's a couple different protocols. One-time observation, which you just did, and if you want to adopt a trail or make observations at your home or something, then you can do life cycle, which is a really great idea too. Next. Yeah, I really emphasized, we talked about this a lot when we were developing this program. You know, we took a while to figure out what to call these observations, but we're all, as scientists, we're all focused on these life cycle observations. We're used to having study sites and lots of students and lots of grant funding and making extremely detailed observations all the time. And so we thought, wouldn't it be great if everybody did that? And then a number of people pointed out, well, that's kind of a huge commitment to do that. You know, why don't we make it really simple and easy for people so we can get a lot more data and still, you know, get the spatial coverage we need. And so we came up with this protocol called one time. And this can be very scientifically valuable too, especially, you know, if your local chapter decides to make observations on particular areas, a trail that you always hike every spring, always have a field trip, a particular place every spring, or a local open space that you've adopted that your members go to a lot. If you get a whole bunch of one-time observations collectively, then you've got something like just as good as life cycle observations. You've really covered when things happen with all these different species. So it's a great way to start. And I think the thing is that if you're out looking at plants anyway, this is something you can do anytime you're out looking at plants. You can always make a budburst observation, especially if you notice a plant is just coming into flower, or it's just starting to fruit or something like that, or leaves are just starting to turn. It's a pretty simple thing to add to what you're already doing, and I think it adds to your enjoyment to learn more about what you're seeing out there. Next slide. Okay, and this is the report that I think we sent out to everybody. This is just from their website. So if you would like to take observations on paper, you don't want to use your phone or something like that, before you go out on your field trip, you can print out a bunch of these forms, and this kind of gives you a prompt for what kind of information you need. So you just put in the date at the top, what the name of the plant is, and some locational information. You usually don't know precisely what your latitude and longitude is, but you might know the name of the trail, or name of a park, or the address of a house you're at making an observation. And when you get on the website, Budburst will look up the lat long for those. It knows about those things with Google. So we've made that a lot easier now. And then I usually give my site names my own name, so I know what it is. Lat long doesn't mean much to me, but I have, you know, my house, my cabin, my Devil's Backbone, you know, the areas where I make observations. And that way, by putting in that name, then I can organize my data. Like I can say devil's backbone, and then all my observations devil's backbone will come up, for example. So that's a kind of a cool way to add to your own information about the areas that you like to visit. Anyway, and then after that, you get into, you mark what the phenological stages are. So that's basically what you do with this paper form. And let's go through this a little more detail. Next slide. Okay, so let's make an observation. Okay, a few weeks, I guess almost back in June 12th, when Maggie and I were talking about doing this webinar, I went up to the cabin and walking around, making a lot of budburst observations, checking out the new revisions of the website. And I walked into this beautiful aspen forest. It's a little riparian area right behind the cabin. And I'd been watching it for a while. And as it turned out, the Colorado blue columbine came into bloom that day, just happened to be. And so I thought, oh, this is a perfect example of, you can't have a wildflower more iconic than that. Nobody's going to misidentify this plant, I don't think. So anyway, this is a great example. So it came into bloom, and if you look at this photo, it's a little hard to see, but there's some flower buds in the background. So you can see there's several flower buds that have not opened yet. And so this is the only one that's open. So this is in the first flower stage. And then in this forest, there are only a few of these that are actually open. So I really had caught the first flower stage. So that was kind of cool. Okay, next slide. So here's the paper report, and I just filled it out. I said, okay, my handwriting is horrible. I'm a PhD, right? But anyway, it's Colorado blue columbine. And budburst is trying to make it as easy as possible for everybody. And so it's common name oriented. And so when you get on the website, you need to put in a common name, even if you mostly deal with Latin names. You have to give it some sort of common name. And then I happen to know, it was on my phone and everything, so I happen to know what the lat long was. So I put in the lat long, and then I put in the scientific name, and then my name for the site, and then the nearest town. You know, like if you're making an observation in a town, when you enter it on the website, you just give the zip code or the name of the town, and then budburst will bring up a Google map, and you'll tell you the lat long. So that makes it really easy, so people don't have to deal with that. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then the bottom half of the form are the phenophases. And so for wildflowers, which is what I totally recommend starting with, is you've only got a couple of phenophases for flowers and for fruit. So it's pretty straightforward. Either you got no flowers, there's nothing to report really, or you've got early, which we're defining here as fewer than 5% flowers. Like I said, in that aspen grove, there are only a couple flowers out. So that clearly went into that category. Middle, many flowers emerged. That's usually pretty easy to define. And what I do is when I go out there, I'll see, do I see many unopened flower buds? You know, is everything pretty much in flower? It doesn't have to be everything, but are most things, more than 50% of the flowers open. You see very few unopened buds. Then you're definitely in that middle stage. And that middle stage is the most common stage you're going to record, because flowers usually are in that stage for quite a while, usually several weeks at least. And then the late stage would be where most of the flowers have shriveled up, and you might just see just a few flowers are open, and that's the late stage, which is a hard one because sometimes they fade all at once. And what I see too that's kind of interesting is that the flowers can be really fast. You know, you could observe the early stage one day, and you can go out that trail the very next day, and everything's open. And so that's why these early stages are so valuable. They really are keyed into a very specific time. And then later on, I've seen some of these, even now, a number of plants of the early spring plants are now producing fruits, which aren't necessarily nice to eat fruits. They're often spiny, you know, dandelion-like fruits, but they're still fruits. And so you've got that early, same kind of scenario. You got that early stage where you see very few that are fully ripe. And like I say, if it's a wind dispersed fruit, usually it spreads out. You can tell it's dried out and it's opened its little barbs and everything, or it's cracked its capsule or something. And if it's a fleshy fruit, then usually the color changes. But this is what's kind of cool about it. You're going to learn even more about your plants by trying to figure out these phenophases. You'll be keying in some different things and noticing some different stuff. And then you've got that middle stage of fruiting where definitely more than half of the ripening fruits are actually ripe. And that stage should persist for quite a long time until the wind blows them down or birds eat them or something. And of course, this is really valuable in terms of ecology and natural history to be documenting fruits. That is so important for wildlife to know when fruits are out. Really important for wildlife conservation too. I worked with some bear biologists doing that when I was in Alaska. It was really interesting. And then the late stage where most of the fruits have dropped off, you just see a few. So that's basically what so you've got that information. And of course you could do now that you kind of understand this a little bit, in your normal field notebook where you record observations of wildflowers, now you can just add these few extra things to your observation. You write down the species and the date and location, which you would normally do anyway, and then say, okay, it was in the early, you could write down, it was in the early flowering stage. I could see several unopened buds and there was just a couple in flower, and then you've got the information that you can then, and you got location. So then you got the information to submit it to Budburst when you get home. Or if you've got an iPhone or something, you take a picture and they'll give you a lot of that information too. It makes it a little bit easier. Just like iNaturalist. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so when you get back home, then you want to submit your observation to the Project Budburst website. You get on the website and there's a Get Started. When you get to the home page, there's a Get Started section. You can click on that and they'll provide a lot of instructions on how to submit your data. And you've already created an account, so you just have to log on. And then when you get to your main screen, there will be a little box that's green. It says new, and you click on new. That's how you make a new observation. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when I go to the Budburst website, it brings up my dashboard, which I think is kind of cool. It's similar to iNaturalist in some ways, but it brings up this dashboard and it'll say, okay, I've submitted 607 observations since the program started, 181 species, so that's kind of cool. Kind of like a life list for botanists. And then on the left-hand side, it lists all the species I've made observations. And then it has a map there in the bottom, and you see those little green blotches. Well, like I mentioned before, once you get into it, it can be really quite fun and addictive, I guess. And when I'm traveling across the country, going to a science conference or visiting family or friends, oftentimes I'll notice plants and I'll say, oh, wow, that's reaching the first flower stage. And I'll write it down and I'll submit it to Budburst. So you can see I got all these observations in different parts of the country. And if I click on that cluster for Colorado, then my observations for Colorado come up. Next slide. So I think this is true of iNaturalist and also eBird. If you take bird observations, these databases, when you contribute to them, they're kind of a cool way of keeping track of your own observations. So here I can see this is where I've made Budburst observations in Colorado. So I've gone up and down the Front Range, but haven't done too well on the Western Slope, it looks like. But it's just kind of cool to see where you've been, and then you can go back and you can click on each of those to see what species did you observe, when or where. And then the maps will also tell you what if other species other people have observed that same species. So you can see how your observations compare with everybody else's. So it's really cool. You're part of a community making these observations, and I think it's just really neat to see the patterns, either in your region or across the country. It's an early spring here, as it is early spring in Georgia. You can go to Budburst and see if they're getting an early spring. It's pretty neat. Okay, next. Next slide. There you go. Yeah, so then, oh yeah, I guess I missed, didn't mention the last slide. The last slide, you clicked on new, that little green button new in the upper right-hand corner to make a new observation. So we clicked on new, and then this screen comes up. It's saying, okay, submit a one-time observation. It'll ask you, do you want to do a one-time observation or a life cycle observation? Well, for what you just did at break, it's a one-time. So you click one time, then you come to this screen. And so you submit your photos in that first box there. You can just click on that, and then you can scroll around your computer to find your computer file. Click on that, and that photo will come in there. And you do multiple photos, and of course they want you to do multiple photos, ideally. Photos of the whole plant, close-up of the flower, whatever. You put that all in there. And then Budburst will then, if those photos have locational information, then Budburst will automatically fill in your location. This was an iPhone photo, and so it automatically filled in. It figured out I was in Boulder County, and it figured out my lat long, so it filled that out already, so I don't have to mess with that. And then the next box is, what species was it? So like I said, it's common name oriented. So what I did for this one, since everybody knows what a columbine is, I just started saying Colorado blue, and then there was a drop down of all these different species. Oh, was that a Colorado blue columbine? And then you just, yes, it was. You click on it, and then you proceed. And the other thing will happen, a lot of you are making observations on more rare and unusual and specialized species when you go to these really cool habitats around here. And you'll likely run into a species that's not on Budburst's list. Budburst has a list of about 100, and last time I checked, they have about 117 common species in Colorado that they have information for. And if you're making an observation on one of those, it will come up as the common name, the scientific name, and all the phenophases and all that kind of stuff. If your plant isn't on their list, you don't see it in that drop down when you enter your data, then what you do is you just write in the name. I would write in a common name for it. And what I do is then I put in a comma and a space and then put in the scientific name, because I think it's more valuable to know the scientific name. And then you hit a return. And now that's going to be a new species. It's going to be added to your list, so you can make future observations of that species. And then it'll ask you, what kind of plant is it? Is it a wildflower? Is it a grass? Is it a shrub or tree? Because those plants have slightly different phenophases, like I explained before. If it's a wildflower, you've just got those flower and fruit stages. If it's a shrub, you've got all those leaf stages in addition to the flower stages. If it's a grass, it's got like a pollen stage, they call it, when it's actually shedding pollen. And it's got when the flower stalks come out. So it's got some different stages. So that's why you need to know the type of plant. So you tell the type of plant, and then it'll give you the phenophases to fill out in the lower part of the screen. So we've filled out, we put in the photos, we've identified the plant, which will be verified by other people later on, hopefully. And then we've got the location. We got that from the photo. And if it wasn't in your photo, you could just fill that in, and it would take you to the Google site. So you could say, oh yeah, it's right there, right by this building or right by that trail, and they'll automatically give your lat long. And then optionally, you've said, okay, this was taken at my Aspen site at my cabin. And so I know I have my own name for where it was. Okay, next slide. And I call my cabin Moss Rock. So riparian is the habitat. So that's why I call it Moss Rock riparian. So I could keep those observations separate from the rest of the area that has really different phenology. Okay, then you have this kind of cool graphic for putting in your phenophase observations. You've got, everything's a cycle in nature, right? And so we've got these nice little circles that show the cycles of these different phenological stages. So we got flowers and fruit. So you've got the very top, you got these little circles, little white dots on the circle there. And so at the very top says none. You didn't have any flowers. If you had no flowers, you just click on none. If you had the very first flowers, you'd click there on first. And then the early stage is a few flowers. It isn't absolutely just the one flower that's out. There are a number of flowers, but it's still less than 5%. And that's what it was for this one. So I clicked early. So you can see that early is filled in green. I clicked on it, it should turn green. And then the same thing with fruit. If it was fruiting, you would choose what's the best stage right there. And then the other thing you can do, which I think is always really valuable, both for yourself and also for people that are verifying your observation, is especially if you're a little bit uncertain identification or the phenophase or anything like that, then you can put in notes in this bottom box. Like this one, I put in this note that, okay, I observed it just a few days ago and it wasn't in flower. So I know it just came into flower the last couple of days. So that lets people know, okay, this is exactly when it came into flower. This is a pretty accurate observation for when this first came into flower. So that helps. But I could have made any other observations. It's chewed up by bugs, or the leaves look really weird and they're starting to wilt, any kind of useful observation you make out in the field, especially that could help people verify your observation. Like if you weren't sure if it's first flower or early flower, you could put in notes, well, I saw this one flower in this plant, but there's other flowers in other areas, and I wasn't sure whether, what the stage was, but this is what I saw, and, that helps make it more accurate. And then after that's all, you've basically collected all you need for this observation. So now there's a green box in the bottom that says Save Observation. So click on that, and then next, we'll see the next screen. Okay, so now the photo comes up and it's a little bigger so you can actually see it and say, yep, that was the right photo. That was a columbine, all right. And then you got this little red leaf, and that's showing the location on the map of where that observation was made. Because you might have made a mistake in, if you were hand entering the lat and long location, and you look at the map and it's nowhere near where you were, we realize, oh, whoops, let's redo that. And so you've got a green button on the upper right-hand corner that says Edit. So you click on Edit, and then you can go back and fix any mistakes you might have made on your observation, And so I think that's a really helpful thing. And so you've made an observation. That's all there is to it. Next slide. And I think the exciting thing about all of this is, we tend to be locally focused. We've got the trails and natural areas that we like to go hiking and visit all the time. And we're making these observations, and we don't know how valuable they are to scientists in the world, And what we just did by entering that in BudBurst means it's on a website that's available to scientists all over the world. And your observation is added to all the thousands of ones that other people have made to help us understand the natural world. I just think that's just so cool that you can do that. And, and that's true of iNaturalist too, but that's what I think is really quite exciting. And the more observations you make, the more friends and family you get to participate in this, the more valuable it becomes. And I think the more fun it becomes, because you just are learning new things about places you care about. It's pretty cool. So anyway, yeah, one thing I hope that some chapters will want to do is do something like this. These one-time observations are great, and you could do that as a chapter. Like if you identified, oh, we always do field trips to this local open space. Well, you could adopt that, and you could encourage your members and your friends to do observations over there, to make sure they get over there at different times of the year and make observations so we can have a really good record on that natural area, and that would make it, I think, interesting. You know, oh, I saw this flower came in flower this week. You know, that's really unusual. It's 2 weeks early this year or something, you know, and it becomes a really nice record that'll be interesting to you. And of course, it's much more scientifically valuable because the more frequently you make these phenology observations, the more accurate and useful the information becomes. And it doesn't fall on just one person. If you have a bunch of people just deciding to visit a particular area, then you can get really good information without necessarily doing anything really different than what you're doing before. You're still hiking in places you want to go hiking. So anyway, I think that's something to consider. And then you can get into these life cycle phenophases. If you get committed to that, you know, you say, okay, well, this is what I'm monitoring, this particular plant and this particular trail, and this is what it's doing this week. And then you've really made something really quite accurate, you know. And that's what I use trails a lot. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I'll divide a trail up into sections. And so I'll make observations in different sections of the trail. And that way I know I'm really making very similar observations from week to week. And that's a really neat way to do it. And of course, you're doing that because you're getting the lat long, so you're knowing exactly where you're making observations. But that's kind of sometimes the trails have a huge elevational range, and so it's kind of nice to keep your observations separate in different parts of the trails. And it's usually pretty easy. There's like a meadow at the beginning of the trail, you hike into a forest, and then you break into the alpine. You could just kind of have observations broken up that way. Yeah, so this is kind of a neat thing to do. I hope some of the chapters can try to do this, and I think it'll add a lot of enjoyment to appreciating these local areas. With this kind of more systematic observations, you're probably going to see a lot more plants or different plants, or observe what plants are doing more than you would when you're just casually walking through, trying to just identify what's there. Okay, next slide. Next.
I'm on the recommended plant side. Is that good?
Oh, there you go. You got it. Yep. Yeah, another thing I think we can decide to do here in Colorado that would be good. Like I said, budburst has 117 common species that they've described for us. But, you know, we were talking about identification earlier and all the complexities and difficulties of identifying a lot of these plants in certain groups. You know, one thing that I think would be really valuable is, why don't we try to see if we could agree, maybe each chapter could do it, or the whole society could do it for Colorado, to decide, you know, what are the most iconic, common species that occur in our state that everybody knows how to identify. And let's try to make sure, that doesn't mean we can't do observations of rare species, but let's at least make sure when we're going out in the field, we try to make sure we make observations on these species so that we can get really consistent, valuable data. And I gave a presentation for the naturalists in Larimer County. I'm a volunteer naturalist in Larimer County as well, with their open space program. And I've been trying to get them to, encouraging them to do budbursts for a number of years. And so we were talking about this a number of years ago and said, well, for example, these are some plants that might be really good to observe in our open space areas. And, you know, ponderosa pine, knowing when the pollen comes out, when the leaves come out, cottonwood, of course, aspen, mountain mahogany, rabbit brush, three-leaf sumac, blanket flower probably everywhere in Colorado. Sand lily is very characteristic early spring plant. And then a weird one is feral rye. That's because they've got a lot of old fields, and we've got a lot of rye that is growing along the trails in the open space. So that's one of our common species. And more broadly in Colorado, just thinking about today, I added a few others here, that chokecherry is actually one of the most valuable species in budburst, because chokecherry occurs all across the country. and it has all these different phenological stages. And so we have lots and lots of data in chokecherry. So, and it's quite commonly planted in Colorado. I know in my area, I see it in a lot of neighborhoods and subdivisions, various cultivars of chokecherry, the Canada Red being a really common one. But anyway, there's a lot of chokecherry around. So if you make an observation chokecherry, that's great because that adds to a really good database that Budburst is developing for the country. And of course, Columbine, you know, it just seems like as Coloradoans, we can't ignore Columbine. And then there are a lot of annual sunflowers out there that I think they would be really good ones for us to try to keep track of. The pasque flower is certainly a very beautiful spring flower that people usually notice, and it's got a very characteristic fruit. So that's one it's easy to note the fruits on. Lance leaf spring beauty is one that's very broadly distributed across our country. You know, it's very common back east in the Midwest, as well as here in Colorado. And so that's kind of a neat one because you've got a lot of comparisons to make across the country, and maybe some others. But this is something our working group and task groups can work on. Is I think it's a good idea to come up with some really common, and we could add some weeds to this too. You know, some common species that we can encourage everybody to try to look for. You know, because a lot of times we're really focused on, you know, the kind of the unusual things, you know, and sometimes we have to sort of step back and realize, oh, well, let's make sure we notice the common things too, because those really matter too. Next slide. Yeah, so again, just to kind of review about this, I mean, it's really fun to go out and make those observations. I think once you get into it, it's a really neat way to enjoy these natural areas and learn more about native plants. But at the same time, just taking a little bit of extra time to note what the phenological stage is of the plants you're looking at, and keep track of your locations and take a photo, just a little bit of effort, extra effort, you can really make, I think, a very important contribution to science in our scientific understanding of the natural world. It's just kind of incredible. By participating in Budburst, by submitting these observations, you can help scientists document differences in phenology with our region, within our region, different areas in our mountains. We have very different phenologies, documenting some of these differences, which is very helpful for people. Maggie mentioned, you know, land managers, you know, understanding conservation and what we should be watching for, what species are changing their behavior dramatically or becoming more rare or whatever. That's really going to help us a lot. And then help with this, just simply having good, consistent observations on when plants come into flower, when they come into fruit. Scientists can use those observations with all the other data they have to start to really understand how is the natural world adapting to these changes in weather and climate that we're seeing. You know, how are plants adapting to this? And then like just now, there was a great question asked about phenology lag times, you know, that the weather is affecting bud set, and then you're seeing a difference the next year. There's all these complex interrelationships, and the more data we have, or more people contributing that data, helps scientists figure these things out and helps us ultimately both appreciate the natural world more and how incredible it is, but then also be better stewards of the natural world by understanding these things. So it's a really, really important thing. And then over time, we'll eventually have this historical data that our kids and grandkids are really going to benefit from. Okay, next slide. And I think it's personally, and this is the thing we've talked about, citizen science is so interesting because, like I've said, there's a real need for more people making observations to promote our scientific understanding of the earth. Scientists can't be everywhere all the time. And having a whole bunch of people looking at the natural world is just fantastic for helping scientists better understand what's really going on. But it's more than that. It's, I think, participating in this process of actually having fun outdoors, but then actually trying to contribute to science, it can be a very empowering thing. You know, it's pretty, you know, I think it's a motivating thing. You know, if I'm trying to track the phenology in some particular trail, you know, there might be kind of a crummy day. It's a little bit hot, a little bit cold. Normally I wouldn't go there, but I said, God, you know, it's been 7 days. I really need to go out there and see what's going on out there. It's a kind of a motivator to get outside. And then when you do that, when you go out and observe things in times when you normally wouldn't be there, that's often when you see something new. I've been really amazed by that. That's often how it is. So it's a way to help you enjoy where you live, I think, and enjoy these natural areas and appreciate them in a new dimension. And so I think there's a lot of personal enjoyment you get in participating in these programs. And then, you know, in terms of conservation, you know, this is a way you can help people better understand the value of these natural areas and then help conserve these beautiful places. Like we said, the whole theme of this is you care about what you know. And when you start making these observations on a regular basis, you're going to get to know these areas really well. And I think you're going to develop a real attachment to those areas. And I think that's a real benefit of participating in this program. We hope that people, you know, get a lot of personal enjoyment out of this. This isn't just a job. This is actually a neat way to appreciate nature and make a contribution to science, to your natural area. So that anyway, that's what I hope everybody that participates can feel, that they're doing something that's really valuable and they're getting a lot out of it. And that's what we're trying to design these citizen science programs to do. Next slide. Yeah, so I mean, I'm really happy that we all of you have signed up for this webinar and that there seems to be a lot of interest in doing Budburst and making that one of the things that Native Plant Society participates in even more. I know they're already some people are already participating, but getting more people involved is really exciting. So there's a lot of things we could do to help promote this program, to get more people to participate and to make our data that much more valuable. I think a lot of people in the Native Plant Society have all kinds of special expertise that be incredibly valuable in making all this data more accurate and useful to science. And so that would be really fantastic to get people that already are interested in these native plants to work in various ways in this project. And so, yeah, I think I would like to see us talk about the leaders in the different chapters, talk about, can we agree on some common species? At one time, Budburst had a top 10. That might be one approach. We could say, there's our top 10 species we should all be trying to focus in on to make sure we get consistent data across all the chapters. That might be something to pursue. And then for all the different chapters, think about, is there a local open space or trail that you might want to focus your observations on? Encourage your members to make observations in a particular area where you do a lot of field trips. And then maybe go to that area in times you normally don't go and see what's going on later in the season, for example. And that would be another thing to be thinking about of what you want to do. And the other thing that could be done is for some people that, you know, can't get out as much, but would really like to contribute. You know, I know all the different chapters have had all these amazing field trips over the years, and they've kept really good records of all these different plants. And some of those observations could be budburst observations, because basically you're noting plants in flower. So you're basically in that peak flowering stage. And so that's more data that we could use. That would be really great. And then you'll have species lists will be on budburst, and that will be really valuable too. So when you make more observations in a particular area, you can see where other people have observed that species. So that would be another good thing to do. And of course, also, now that we're talking about all this, you can talk to your friends and other people you know. You might know somebody who's a really great naturalist and keeps a notebook, and they've been making observations for years and years and years. And you can encourage them to either submit some budburst observations, or you could find some people that might be interested in taking that data and submitting it to Budburst. And that would be pretty neat, because that's, as you can see, that those historical, us making these observations at a regular time and be incredibly valuable to future people in this region, especially since we're under a rapid period of climate change. But finding that historical data is incredibly valuable. What species were here in the past? What was, like in Longmont, there was open space, Rabbit Mountain. There was a Native Plant Society president, I think it was, that could have very detailed phenological record for that trail for over 10 years. And when I first moved to Colorado, I found that data, and that was just fantastic. I used that to learn about the plants in my area, and I used that data to compare with my phenology data, which I was observing about 10 years later. And I could see how phenology had actually, the plants are coming earlier, 2 to 3 days, than what she had purported 10 years later. So it's a really fun thing, and many ways you can go that. And I hope you all kind of think about how you'd like to participate and work with your local chapters and see if you could start making some observations and see where you'd like to take this. Thank you. Is there a next slide? Yeah. Well, happy to answer any questions. I hope this was helpful to people. I think maybe it seems a little complicated at the beginning, but once you make a couple of these observations, I think you get the hang of it pretty quickly, and it's a pretty fun thing to participate in. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, we have some really great questions coming in. I do have to say it is 12:05, so if anybody does need to leave because of time, that's okay. We've got some really good questions you might want to stick around for. They're really good. Okay, so the first one says, please comment on the use of non-native plants to fill gaps as phenology of flowers and pollinators gets increasingly asynchronous. For example, someone living in the Denver garden, she saw queen bumblebees emerging in mid-March utilizing crocus, hummingbirds utilizing honeysuckle vine at their first arrival when everything else was frozen, or the only other thing was the neighbor's feeder. Or in the fall, for example, Mexican sunflowers for the southbound monarchs passing through. Could you comment?
That's a great question. And I think, yeah, it's very interesting, because I think you see a lot of people are thinking there are these very tight associations that this particular insect needs this particular flower. You see recommendations, oh, you should plant these plants, these native plants, because this is what the pollinators need. And there's some instances where that's true, like with milkweed or something. But, I think we wouldn't have very many species of pollinators if they were that specific, especially in Colorado. They have to be extremely adaptable because of all of what we said. The seasons are crazy. Plant species come and go. There's a lot of dynamics going on, and I think you're going to have a talk by Ptolemy next week, right, on pollinators, and he'll probably talk about that a lot. But some of the recommendations I've seen a lot of people say is it's true that native plants are really good for native pollinators in general, but like was mentioned, you can have similar species that could be ornamentals. And if they're in the same genus, the same family, they have very similar flower structures. And you'll see both native and non-native pollinators will be using them. So I think that, as a gardener, this was a little off topic, but as a gardener, I want to attract pollinators. And what I do is I plant all these plants that will flower in different times. And some are strictly native. They're ones that would grow in my area. Some are native to Colorado. Some are native to the Great Plains, and some aren't, but having that combination, I see like native pollinators like bumblebees are absolutely pollinating these plants that are technically not native to my specific area. And so I think that's absolutely true. If we want to promote pollinators, it's valuable to have a variety of species in flower, and that's really true. And that's where knowing the taxonomy is helpful. Knowing what ornamental plants are closely related to is a helpful way to do that. If you know there's a lot of members of the rose family here or some other family, then getting other ones in the same family, similar flower structure, that's a great way of, and that's what we see in nature. These pollinators are extremely adaptable. In fact, there's sort of an interesting controversy with bees. People always think of bees as native, but of course, most of the bees we see are honeybees that are actually European, and there's a little difference. You know, the native plants are used by honeybees, but the native pollinators are more keyed into those. And so there have been instances where there's been competition between the two. And so, yeah, no, that's a really great question. There's a lot of things to think about, but there is a lot of variability, and that's why we need people observing this stuff. I mean, I think the insects that are the pollinators that are succeeding are pretty adaptable, and we need to learn more about what's their adaptability. You know, what species can, like dandelions are another example. We talk about this a lot in Berthoud. The people that are interested in bees, you know, they're saying, you know, don't spray your dandelions in your lawn. The dandelions are a critical early season food for honeybees because nothing else is in bloom then, you know, and so that's a perfect example of what I think you're talking about, you know, that all these plants do matter. And that again goes back to, it's nice to then know the phenology of all these other plants. And so, you know, I keep track of the phenology of all my ornamental as well as my native plants in my garden. It's important to know what they're all doing, and that tells you a lot about what kind of habitat you're creating for pollinators.
Okay,
and can I just add one thing to that? Paul was talking about like how there were mismatches. So sometimes non-native species can fill those gaps in the mismatches. And so that's why it's good to do phenology on the non-natives, because you can see if you match up.
Right. I had a friend in Montana that was really into penstemon, and he had a garden that had hundreds of, you know, literally 100 species of penstemon from all over, from Mexico up through Montana. So there was a penstemon flower all summer long. So it was great for pollinators. So yeah, that's a really interesting, I think that's a really important point.
Okay, I was just counting to see. I think we have about 8 more questions here. Okay. So
we'll go more quickly. Okay, sorry.
Okay, let me go. Wait, let me get back to the first one I was looking at here. Okay. Okay, so this next one is one from a person who's currently in Tucson, Arizona. She says, my native plants in our yard are on a drip system, so they're getting more water compared to plants in the wild. That means that some Bullea multiradiata is blooming now that isn't blooming in the national park and other wild areas. Should we still record bloom in our yard, and is there a way to indicate that the plant is receiving supplemental water?
Yes, it's really important to note that. Yeah, I know we've talked about that a lot when we're starting this program. And so what I would recommend is when there's that note field, when you're making your observation in that note, I would put in there irrigation. Say it's irrigated, you know, and then that'll make it easier for people to sort out that data. That's a really, really important point, because it's absolutely true. Like I mentioned, one of the cues for plants deciding when to flower is moisture availability, especially in a place like Tucson. So yes, that's where the notes field is really valuable. Thanks.
Okay, next question. Which units should you use for latitude and longitude?
Well, as accurately as you can. You know, normally it's on the computer, it's a decimal fraction. It's the latitude and the longitude with a 3-unit decimal fraction. And so, like I said, the way to do that for budburst, I think in a practical matter, if you don't have a camera that has the location, you're taking pictures that has the locational information on it, then have as accurate a description of your location as you can. I was on this particular trail, I was about a mile from the trailhead or whatever, you know, as accurate as you can. And then when you get on the Budburst website, they'll bring up the satellite photo. and then you can mark, where that observation was made, and then it will figure out the lat long. So yeah, that's how that works.
Okay, next question. What do you do when a phase is missed due to weather? Shepherdii I was monitoring did not bloom or set fruit due to the freeze in April.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that happens a lot. I've seen that. That's incredibly valuable. Now, that would be one where what you could do that might be important is you don't know if that's going to happen until you kind of towards the end of the season say, well, I guess it's not going to flower. It's already this time. What I would do is I would submit a bud burst observation where you say there's no flower. Remember, there was that no flower phenophase, and put in that note box. It didn't flower this year. I flowered, and that's incredibly valuable observation. And especially in grasslands, I've noticed that there will be years where the grasses didn't flower because of incredible drought. And that's incredibly valuable observation. So I would put in like no flower and put in a note. Great question.
Very good. Okay. If you have several plants of the same species and they flower at different times, say a week apart or so, how would you enter that in bud burst?
Yeah, right. Yeah. You need to think about what is your study site. I mean, we don't have hard definitions on that right now. I mean, that would be really valuable. We just thought it would be too complicated. But I think in practical matter, it depends on what area you're talking about. Because generally, if you're making a bud burst observation, let's say of wildflowers, you're usually talking about a patch. So an area that's probably less than 10 feet in diameter or something like that, maybe 20 feet at the most. And then you could use that area to then say, okay, in this area, are there just a few flowers? Or does it look like half the flower? Do it that way. And so I think what the questioner is saying is, okay, you go to the site one day and you see just a couple flowers. And the next day you see some other plants that are in flower, but it's still the same general area. Each one of those times, if it's just a few plants and flowers, still just be a few flower stage. So that's how I would do it. But normally what you'd expect in that situation, if it's really the same area, you would think that it would change over time. The first time you go, it's first time you go, there would be the first flower stage. The second time, a few more plants came in flower. Then it's a few flower stage, and eventually go to full. So, but I would do it as a patch, and usually you can kind of figure that out in where you are. That's what you're describing. And even though you can see off on the edge of the horizon, plants are doing something else. I mean, that could be a slightly different microclimate or soils or whatever. And so that might confuse the issue to try to do that. I think it's better to focus on an observation in a fairly small area and do it that way. Okay. And that's what we're learning. You see it's doing something there, and you realize if you go 10 feet, 20 feet down the trail, they're doing something else. And that's what's happened in nature. That's why we're doing this. So anyway, thanks.
Okay, next question. I have a garden with domestic plants as well as some acres that are quote unquote wild. Is it important or valuable to report on the domestic plants like herbs and non-native lupin, for example?
Yeah, we were trying to, for a while, had a program in Bud Burst where we were trying to get people to do the phenology in herbs. And the idea was that everybody's growing a lot of the same species. And so it was a really good index of climate variation around, like oregano and basil and things like that. Yeah. And so the perennials are more valuable. In terms of gardening, the perennials are usually the more valuable observations because there's variability when you plant seeds and things like that. So the annuals, it depends on a whole bunch of other factors, but something like oregano that just is a perennial and it comes up year after year, or tarragon, those can be great bud burst observations, when they flower, when they put out, yeah, and when they fruit, yeah. No, absolutely. I think those are good, even though, and like we said before, if you're irrigating, you should note that. because usually you irrigate those, but those can be great observations, absolutely. And the value to them, the reason why we're emphasizing it is they're easy to make those observations. You can note them every day, and so they can be really accurate observations. So that's why they're really valuable. They can be quite valuable.
Okay, thank you. Next question, this has to do with picture taking. Instead of individual images of the plant parts, could I use an app like Layout to present multiple photos in one image?
Well, the thing is, I think we want these photos are really important for verifying the identification of plants. And so I think we want them to be as big and as detailed as possible. So I think the Budburst site is set up so you can easily submit multiple photos. So I think it'd be much more valuable to submit individual multiple photos. So you have that one close-up of the leaf and another close-up of the bottom of the flower, another picture of the whole plant. You should just submit those as separate photos. And then that will be a great resource for people to use to verify the identity of your plant and also the phenophase. That'd be the other thing we should mention, your photos should show the phenophase too, show that there's some buds that are not open and some are open or something like that. So that's what I would do.
Okay, next one. There are getting to be many online places to report natural observations. If one uses iNaturalist, must you or should you report your event on Budburst and eBird, for example, in addition to iNaturalist?
Oh, absolutely. There's a synergy. That's what we're all so excited about now, because with iNaturalist, it's really good for reporting what species are and where they occur. But there's no easy way to get phenology information. So if you've already made an iNaturalist observation, then you can go over to Budburst and record the phenology. And so then you're adding to the value of that observation, and then the two programs are going to be complementing one another, that in fact, what we are planning, what's eventually going to happen is in the Budburst site, you submit your observation to Budburst, and those photos are going to go off to iNaturalist, and people there are going to review those to make sure the identification is right and certify it as a research grade observation or whatever. So there's a real synergy there. So and I do that too. I report my bird observations to eBird. I report my species IDs to iNaturalist, and then I report phenology to Budburst. And it sounds like a lot, but once you get into it, it's not that hard to do. You've done 90% of the work once you've done an iNaturalist observation. It's just a little bit extra to do Budburst.
Okay. If I cannot identify a common name or scientific name, do I still enter a report and leave those entries blank and enter my observations?
Yes. What you do, like I was saying, if you don't know what the plant is, you can put it. You don't know what the common name is, or you just don't know what the plant is. You can have a description for it. You could say yellow wildflower or something like that. You invent your own name for it, and you hit the return button on your computer, and then it becomes a new species that added to your collection of species you're making observations on. And then you can add notes to it, but you've got the pictures, you can have your name for it, and then you can go on and do your observation. And then ideally what will eventually happen is people will look at your pictures just like they do in iNaturalist. And then they'll eventually, oh yeah, that's what the species was. They'll put the species in there, and then your data is great. So yeah, definitely just put in some sort of name, but you got the picture, and take as many notes as you can when you don't know what it is, and then provide notes in your observation when you submit it. That'll help people figure out what it is.
Okay, next question. Is there an app for Budburst?
No, coming attractions. We're working on it, and I think that will be very exciting. We're working that. I think that's going to be a great way to make observations. And right now, if you're using iNaturalist application, that has a lot of information on it. If you just keep track either in notes there or in your notebook to add on the phenological data, then you can add that when you get back home. But we're definitely working in that. That's one of the things that I was told they were hoping to have a preliminary version in the fall. And what I do, basically, I use my phone as a notebook. And so I record observations on my phone when I'm out in the field. I take pictures and then I add notes. I have a little database, a little notepad thing that I keep the notes, so they're tied to the pictures, and then I enter the data later. But yeah, I know we need it. I mean, there's a lot of people used to using their phone, and that will make it so much easier to make observations. So we're working on it.
Okay. All right. I've seen roost trilobata in two stages of fruit set or late flowering stage in two sides of the same trail. I
Right.
adopt it every week. Is that a colonial type species, or was it just an anomaly based on when these two groups were first established?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I don't know. It's very, that's another thing we can learn by doing this thing. Our classic example is aspen, they're clones. And so in the fall, you can tell what's a clone by when they turn, when the leaves turn, because if they all turn together, then that's one genetic individual. So you can see that. So you can see that sometimes, but the thing that's interesting is that it's hard to know. It's hard to know. But one thing I noticed a lot is you might have a bunch of plants in what you think is the same area, the same environment, but there could be subtle differences that explains why the flowers are consistently a little bit earlier in one plant than another plant. But these are the kind of questions we're trying to answer with this science, so making really detailed observations like that is really great. And I think you should be able to sort that out over time to see how consistent that pattern is. Keep track of it in your notebook and tell us about that. That sounds like a great thing to pursue.
Okay, great. Next question has to do with fruit herbivory by deer. While waiting week by week for flowers of Yucca glauca to fully open, I noticed one week that they were apparently had been snipped off.
Yeah.
Are yucca flowers a preferred food source for deer?
Well, I won't say definitively, but I'll say that has absolutely happened to me a bunch of times. That I'm waiting for this plant to flower, and I'm just really excited to make this observation. Oh, it's about to flower, it's about to flower. I see the flower bud is swelling. It seems like any day this thing is going to burst, and I go there, and there's just a stump. And the deer are even better than I was at finding out when it was going to flower. So that totally happens. And that would be an example. What I would do, that would be a great example where I would submit a budburst observation saying no flower, and the note say it was eaten by deer. So I know it flowered in the last week since the last time I was there, and the deer ate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay. Next question. I often walk trails in Central Park in Stapleton. Lots of common milkweed all over there. And now they're developing pods. I keep looking for caterpillars on the leaves, but have seen none in the past few weeks. I wonder, are there no monarchs in this area now?
No, I don't know. It's spotty. They're in trouble, and they're variable. And it's been interesting. In my yard, I planted some other milkweeds, and I never saw any monarchs. This answers another question. It's very bizarre. So I planted a Mexican sunflower. Somebody said that was a great plant to grow. Monarchs came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, I had all these monarchs came by in their migration in the fall. It was crazy. So yeah, I think it is extremely variable, and that's why we're worried about monarchs there. They've had huge population declines in Mexico and other places, and that's why we're collecting this data. That's why it's important to make these observations to understand what's going on.
Okay, I think this is the last question, but while you're answering it, I will go down and make sure that I have covered all of them. But this last question is, Does Budburst want data on natives growing in my garden? I have 2 Apache Bloom and 2 Pawnee Buttes sand cherry in different corners of the yard, as well as a collection of penstemon.
Absolutely, like we said before, absolutely. The one thing is, like we mentioned before, is if you're irrigating, if you're watering those plants, then you need to note that when you make your observations. But we absolutely, yeah, the garden observations are really fantastic. And if it's a native, that's really great. The only caveat is we would like to know a little bit about whether you're watering it or not. And then that will help us sort it out.
Okay, there's somebody just had a comment on the Monarch. She said she saw one just last week in Golden.
Great. They're not extinct yet. That's great. Okay.
I think that's about it. That should do the questions here.
Well, thanks,
All right.
everybody. This has been fun.
Yeah, and I would just like to thank both of our panelists, Paul Alaback and Maggie Gaddis, for this very informative talk and very empowering talk too, to get us out there and just the little things that we can do to actually make a big difference and big contribution to the world of science. So thank you both for doing this. And again, thank you for doing it and volunteering to do it pro bono. This is something that we've thought it would be a good idea because we want to give back to the CoNPS community. We know right now with COVID-19, a lot of people are in economic hardship, and we just wanted to do something to help everyone and educate everyone. So everyone who wants to anyway, everyone who's interested. So again, thank you both for doing this, for incredible contributions that you're making to the world of science. We really do appreciate it. And thank you all for coming today. Again, we appreciate you coming. I was going to turn on my webcam here so you can see me, but yes, thank you all for coming. And we do have an evaluation that we will be sending out within the next few days or so. So if you could please let us know how you think about webinars. This is also the first webinar we've ever done on GoToWebinar versus GoToMeeting. And we're seeing that there are some definite differences here, but hopefully on your end, it's better for you because like I said before, it cleans the screen. You only have slides and the speakers and a little control box there to answer your questions. So let us know about that too, because we would like that information. But again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you all for coming, and hope you have a great weekend and take care of yourselves. Stay healthy and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
And submit your observations too. Submit those observations you just made.
Absolutely.
And look forward to seeing them.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be heading this out now, but again, thank you all.